Hello, everyone, and welcome to Whiskey Uncorked. My name is Brian, and we are back with another Scotch whiskey review this week. This week, we are talking about a bit of a classic whiskey, I think, at this point. An excellent example of strictly bourbon matured single malt Scotch. Today, we're going to be talking about the Glencadam 10-year-old. Glencadam 10, definitely a whiskey that plays a role as a bit of a gateway whiskey for me in my overall journey, and one that taught me to look away from heavily peated whiskeys, big, dark, heavily sherry influenced whiskeys, and really start to appreciate nuance and, more importantly, learning about distillery character. So, regardless of whether you're talking about bourbon or Scotch or any other style of whiskey, or really any distilled spirit, there are certain production methods, certain processes, decisions that are made during the production process that will lead to a unique profile for that distillery. And oftentimes these distilleries can really start to become known by a very specific thing that they do, right? If you mention Springbank, it's funky. If you mention Kleinlich, it's waxy. If you're talking about bourbon, Jim Beam is nutty, it's peanutty. Old Forester and Jack Daniels can have banana. Wild Turkey is spicy and cherry, and it's just, there's just these qualities that become synonymous with certain distilleries. And a lot of that has to do with the stills, possibly their grain choices, their yeast choices, how they tend to, what barrels they use to age their whiskey, what do they tend to be known for. And sometimes when you're using barrels that are really heavily influencing the whiskey with its previous contents, like sherry, Madeira, port, red wine, if that's too heavy, you can start to kind of lose what makes the distillery unique. On the back of that, if you haven't already learned what a distillery's character is, it can be difficult to kind of separate what's the barrel versus what's coming from the distillery, what's from the production choices that they've made, if you just jump straight into heavily cask influenced whiskeys. And for me, as a bit of a geek, there was definitely a turning point, and this bottle played a pretty major role in that. Not this specific bottle, this is not my first bottle of Glencadam 10, but it was definitely a whiskey that, as I drank it, I got to know it better. And by the end of the bottle, I was absolutely in love with it. And now I feel comfortable where I can go and drink maybe some cask influenced Glencadams, and I will be able to actually tell what part of that experience is from the distillery character. And if I don't find that, then I know that this is just a whiskey that's been drowned in its cask influence. And at least when it comes to Scotch whiskey or other malt whiskey that's made in the Scotch vein, I think most people, that this is completely anecdotal, so if you're not one of these people, totally get it. But I feel like most people eventually come to the point where they really start to appreciate the bourbon matured versions of whiskey from any distillery. And part of that, I think, is just geekiness. I think it's because of the knowledge that they have about what kind of experience they're going to get if they order a glass or they have a bottle. And whatever they go to the shelf, they're going to just be more confident that that bottle is going to kind of hit the spot for them because they understand the differences. And that includes, once you get into that more heavily cask influenced version of a whiskey from that distillery, because you'll be able to still pick out what actually is the distillery and what's the cask. And overall, it helps with your evaluation. It helps with your enjoyment. And the reality is that bourbon cask whiskey makes some of the most interesting, nuanced, and complex whiskey out there. Now, that's not always true. This particular bottle, I don't think, is particularly complex. It's actually fairly straightforward. And maybe even to beginning whiskey drinkers, and maybe even experienced drinkers as well, I wouldn't be shocked to hear someone describe this as being boring. I don't think it's boring. I think it's delicious. And I think it's just an excellent communicator of what Scotch whiskey can be. It's one point on the reference map in terms of here's kind of the base of things. Here's what our spirit can do with some time, minimal cask influence. And the more that the time is really going to be the deciding factor and the differentiating factor in that overall experience, because the casks up to a point aren't going to provide a ton more, particularly if you're really talking about refill barrels, because there's just not much left to give. And you can really just start to see how 10 years versus 15 years versus 25 years, whatever, how that whiskey evolves without the interference, I guess is a way to put it, of, let's say, a sherry cask. Not to say that sherry cask whiskey isn't delicious. We've been going on our own journey with those on this channel over the last year. But it's still never gotten to the point where I don't get excited by whiskey that has that beautiful golden straw color. It's just, I know that my experience is going to be representative of that distillery style, and that distillery style is worth appreciating. Now, there's a bit of an issue that I have, and that's there's not a lot of this out there, especially I had to buy this bottle from the UK. I had to include it in a shipment of whiskey over here not too long ago because I cannot find this in the US anymore. It was available. The last bottle I had prior to this I absolutely bought probably in Denver, and I saw it on the shelf until I was ready to buy another one, and I could not find it. And then some time went by, I looked again, could not find it. That continues till today, where I looked even just earlier today, and I cannot find a bottle of Glencadam 10 for sale anywhere near me. It looks like it pops up as being available in some shops, maybe on the East Coast. Don't know if that stock's just been sitting on the shelf for a long time, or if maybe just whoever's kind of running the distribution on the East Coast is still getting some. We're still willing to buy it. Either way, it looks like that, at least for the time being, we've kind of lost out on one of the few just bourbon examples for Scotch whiskey. You still get Deanston 12, Glenmorangie 10, and now the new 12-year-old are still available. There's others as well, but those I think are kind of the two that, or were the three that I always really thought of as just really clear examples of unpeated bourbon cask forward or just spirit forward whiskey that we can get from Scotland. And if we're losing one of those for whatever reason, hopefully it's just temporary. Hopefully eventually it comes back onto shelves here and we can get these things a little more easily without having to purchase them online. And I don't like buying these bottles from overseas just because the value proposition is usually lost when you're paying the big shipping prices and duties and all that sort of thing that kind of come with getting a bottle over to the US. You can maybe throw 1, 2 in there maybe on occasion if you have just really nothing else to get. That's going to make sense just to get that kind of shipping price into a reasonable, quote unquote, reasonable area. But I was pretty intent on getting another bottle of this. I had been waiting quite a while. And I also needed to pick up a Loch Lomond 12-year-old, which I also cannot find currently anywhere around me, or even in some of the other areas of the country that I do frequent on occasion. That seems to be disappeared too. I know they did a little bit of a rebrand recently, and I'm just kind of maybe hoping that there's been a delay. But I got one of those as well, just so I can do a review on the channel, because I've really been enjoying Loch Lomond and stuff lately. We'll do that one pretty soon. But obviously for today, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to do some tasting notes and give this thing a score. And why don't we jump right into that? All right, so they do give you some tasting notes on the actual tube here. As I mentioned, the color is straw gold. The nose says lively, intense, grassy freshness, and citrus tones with hints of spicy oak. The palate is rounded elegance, clean, crisp citrus tones, a pleasing harmony between a natural sweetness and the soft, spicy oak. And then the finish is long and soothing, rich, clean barley, and gristy sweetness. Generally speaking, Can't really argue with those too much. It'll just be a matter of some slight interpretations this way and that way. Probably not going to expand on those notes with anything groundbreaking or anything like that. But yeah, I think Glencadam 10 is a whiskey that's well respected in the Scotch community, but oftentimes, kind of like Deanston 12, doesn't get mentioned a lot in those just top tier kind of 10, 12-year-old brand introductions that tend to garner a lot of the hype. Although they've both had their time in the spotlight, I think. They've both gotten lots of attention from online reviewers and just the community in general. Most Scotch drinkers will probably tell you that they enjoy both of them, although obviously not everyone is going to love this particular style. It is what it is, but I'm glad we do still have some examples of these whiskeys kind of floating around, at least here in the US, and I'm hoping the ones that we do have, or had as of recently, do stick around. But let's jump into the tasting notes and see how this is going to smell today. Here we go. So it jumps out of the glass. It's very fragrant. I think, yeah, they describe it as lively on the tube here. I can definitely agree with that. It's a pretty recognizable nose at this point for me, or at least indicative of the type of experience that I'm going to have. I immediately kind of recognize this as a little bit of a malt bomb is probably the wrong word, but it's just immediately hit with just that malty Scotch whiskey, lots of vanilla. The citrus notes for sure, like very light lemon, maybe even like lemon lime, but it's very kind of light and just a bit of a spritz. Grassy, I can definitely see that. It's much more of like a fresh kind of field of grass. It's just kind of definitely has that outdoors, summertime, just real clean, malty experience that you often are going to get with younger, now 10 years isn't young, but it's obviously on that introductory level from what we usually think of Scotch whiskey as being. But there's nothing dirty in here at all. It's almost got just almost like a fresh, I don't say fabric softener because I think that might put people off a little bit, but it just kind of has like that comforting, warm, fresh scent. Again, the nose isn't particularly complex. It's pretty easy to read. You can dig in it as much as you want. You're not going to find anything too weird or off or new. All going to be pretty familiar if you spent any amount of time nosing Scotch. So it's a comforting nose. It's easy and just relaxing almost. But let's see how that translates onto the palate. Here we go. Cheers. So the palate translates very directly from what you're getting on the nose. Maybe a little more complex. Obviously, you're kind of getting the different sensations that are happening to kind of mix things up a little bit. But you're getting something pretty almost like chewy, almost nougaty. Sometimes I look for like cocoa powder in these styles of whiskey, and I feel like that might be something that comes out a little bit more as I get further into the bottle. But there's maybe just an ever so slight touch. I kind of talked about the wood influence on the tasting notes, and it does kind of come out. I don't pick it up as an oaky spice, maybe slightly, but there is just a very nice kind of under layer of oaky, kind of slightly bitter quality. But again, it's kind of breaking up what would otherwise be maybe something that's a little too straightforward. And it's just adding a nice layer of something else in there. So it's a really well balanced whiskey for sure. The overall flavor experience is full from the beginning to the end. Not a crazy finish. Not really going to expect that from a 10-year-old bourbon matured whiskey, but it certainly lingers. It's something that, again, this is a summer dram. It's almost refreshing. Not quite effervescent, but just something you can just sit there and just easily sip. while probably even being outside, although probably wouldn't want it to get hot. But let's go back for a second sip and see if there's anything else to pull out of here. Cheers. A really nice silky texture. The malt is obviously going to be the star of the show. I don't think of this as a particularly fruity bourbon cask, and you can get very fruity bourbon cask, but it's going to depend a lot on the spirit. Here, similar to the nose, it's just a little bit of citrus, maybe an ever so slight touch of like pickled ginger or something like that. Not pickled ginger, just probably ginger. The sweetness is really well balanced. I mean, it's a touch of like a honey, but it's all coming from the malt. So I can tell I've never had Glencadam's like just raw spirit, but you can tell that's just going to be this bright, fresh, malty, slightly citrusy. I wouldn't expect it to taste even much different from what's going on here. The bourbon casks aren't flooding it with vanillas, aren't flooding it with any sort of baking spice or anything like that, which usually don't get on bourbon cask aged Scotch whiskey to begin with, since bourbon doesn't really affect the Scotch, the whiskey in the barrel like say a sherry would. But it's just something you can just drink and just enjoy without having to think about it too hard. I think I've drank a lot more bourbon cask matured Scotch whiskey since I had my first bottle of this, and so it's not as surprising to me. It's, you know, coming from someone who maybe did think that darker whiskey ended up providing more flavor or was more interesting. This was a whiskey that at that time completely put me down another path that still continues to this day. But this is a stalwart in terms of just its easy, flavorful, completely inoffensive example of what an ex-bourbon matured whiskey can be. Before I give it a score, I know the tasting notes to talk about it being grassy, and that's a note that can turn some people off. Obviously for me, I don't taste it as being grass. You can talk about maybe a little bit of the dryness coming from like a hay or something, but it's more of a sensation and less of a flavor. I am mostly focused on that sweet maltiness, that almost like a nougat from a candy bar or a malted milk ball with, again, not much chocolate on this particular one, at least not yet. Still fairly new to this bottle, but I wouldn't necessarily worry about the quote-unquote grassiness unless you know you just have a really strong aversion to that. But it is probably something that will fade, like a lot of flavors that stand out really strongly when you first get into either a completely new style of whiskey, or maybe even a distillery that you're just getting to know with a flavor that you don't normally taste. Sometimes it takes a little while just for your brain to let that meld back into the overall experience. In terms of a score, I thoroughly enjoy this. I don't think this is necessarily worthy of some crazy score, just because it's not trying to be super complex. It's not trying to completely alter your sense of what Scotch whiskey can be, unless you never drink bourbon matured Scotch. But so I think this fits right there in with a lot of these other 10, 12 years old in terms of like a 7 out of 10, which is very good. The quality is very high. You can tell that a lot of care and skill went into making something like this. Just don't expect to be blown away by the amazing complexity of the Glencadam spirit at this point, or at 10 years of age. I picked up a 21-year-old for a pretty good price a while back. I think I got it at Costco. It was a good price. I can't remember exactly what I paid for it. And I'm looking to, that's almost ended up as being like a special bottle that I've been saving, just because you don't see it a lot here in the US. I mean, it is around. It is probably still one of the Glencadams you can still find, but it does tend to be fairly pricey. The new 18-year-old that they released either early this year or last year, that ended up being kind of disappointingly pricey. So the 15-year is still a good deal. Even the 15-year though, I was looking at like Total Wine. It looks like I have to like go all the way up to like Los Angeles to be able to get a bottle of that, maybe, if they do actually still have it in stock, but probably not worth the 2-hour drive up there and back just for that. But yeah, the Glencadam 10, I'm happy to give a 7. Very good. This is an excellent whiskey. It's still a whiskey that I would have no problem having on my shelf as like just a perma shelf type whiskey, something that's just on there all the time. And in terms of value, it's a little hard. It looks like, at least like on like winesearcher.com, when you looked for this in the US, trying to find some places that had it, it looked like it was still kind of listed for $50 or $60. Whether those prices are accurate or not, I don't know. In the UK, it looks like this is about this is a 50-pound bottle, which would put kind of a 1-to-1 exchange rate at like $65 after tax. I wouldn't be surprised if we do see another wave of this, if it's up in that $70 range. I think that would be a little bit unfortunate because now you're just competing with things that do a little bit more. Although I think in 2024, this would still be a bottle that, provided I wasn't going through them really quickly, and this is just one I had on my big shelf, I think $70 is probably my limit for what I would be like happy to pay for it. But if this is $60, feels a lot better. So if you can still get this for $60 or less in your area, I would probably go at least grab one if you haven't already, unless you just know you just do not like this style of whiskey. But yeah, I wish I could still pick these up for $60. Kind of regret waiting as long as I did to decide to pick up another one. But anyways, I think that's going to wrap it up for me. Thank you for letting me indulge myself in a straightforward but very high quality whiskey that really helped send me down a path into kind of discovering the category of Scotch that I really, really enjoy. So until next week, everyone, please like, comment, and subscribe below, all the YouTube stuff. But until next week with another Scotch whiskey review, cheers.